welcome to another Chapter 7 video. This one is about how to use the t-distribution table. We glanced at that just a little bit whenever we were doing the confidence interval when sigma was known. We will use the t-table when sigma is unknown. And remember, sigma is the population standard deviation. So that's the situation where we're dealing with that. If you know that, it means use the t-table. Now, things that you must know when you're getting ready to do this. You must know, one, the confidence amount, the confidence interval. For example, a 90% confidence interval. Two, the sample size. Those are the two things that determine a t-score. And what the sample size is used for is what's called the degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom. The degree of freedom has a notation, df, and it is n minus 1. It's based on the fact that if I have n different things to choose from, 91 of them can be free of choice, but then the last one I have no choice on which one to choose. So degrees of freedom, n minus 1, and that's for a confidence interval. A confidence interval. Not necessarily for everything else. We will run into things later where your degrees of freedom will not be n minus 1. So that's an important thing to remember there as we go further into the examples, into the chapter. I want to do an example. And we're going to do an example of a 90% confidence interval with my sample size of 25. So that's the first example we're going to look at. If my n is 25, then my degrees of freedom, n minus 1, is 24. And with my confidence interval of 90%, then when I get ready to calculate the t-score, I have to go to my t-table, and with my t-table, looking at a 90% confidence interval, and our degrees of freedom. Our degrees of freedom are all the way over on the left, and we were looking at a 90% confidence interval. So down here, we look at degrees of freedom. Down here is the column for confidence intervals. We wanted a 24 degrees of freedom, which if you pull across here, will match with a 1711. So 90% confidence, 24 degrees of freedom, 1.711. So here, our t equals 1.711. You have to identify your degrees of freedom and then the t-score. I want to look at one more example here with this of just calculating a score, and that one will be a 95% confidence interval and my sample size is going to be 42. With a sample size of 42, my degrees of freedom, n minus 1, is 41. Now when we go to that t-table and we look for our t, we are looking in the 95% confidence interval, right down there. And our degrees of freedom along here, we were looking for 41 degrees of freedom. Notice there is no 41. So we have to back up to the 40. We always back up to a lower score. Because 41 would make it a better sample than it actually was. And as we go across there, we will get to the 2.021. So there's our t-score for 95% confidence interval when our degree of freedom is not an exact value. So 2.021. So the two types, when the degrees of freedom match up perfect, and then when they're off and you have to back up. That will get us through the use of the t-table.